I stood between those two impossibly small white coffins, and I swear my legs didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. The funeral home was heavy with that cloying mix of lilies and roses, the kind of sweetness that turns sour in your throat, and every breath made me want to gag. The candles hissed and crackled, the sound of stiff fabric brushing against itself filled the room. Someone sobbed too softly to make sense of, and then, cutting through everything, came her voice. Clear, sharp, steady, like she'd rehearsed it. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Whitmore. She said it like a sermon. God took them because he knew what kind of mother they had. I can still feel the way those words carved straight into my chest, like a knife you don't see coming. A few heads in the rows ahead of me nodded. Were they agreeing? Were they pitying me? I couldn't tell anymore. I couldn't separate sympathy from judgment. My husband stood stone still beside me in his perfect suit, fists buried in his pockets, silent, always silent. And then I felt a smaller hand searching for mine, warm, determined. My Sophie, only 7, standing there in a black dress too grown for her little body, her thin tights already wrinkled around the knees, her eyes carrying years she hadn't lived yet. She squeezed my fingers 3 times, our secret signal, I love you. I answered back, though my hand trembled so badly it felt numb. My body was shutting down, but she was anchoring me. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore walked right up to the microphone, no invitation needed, her heels clicking with authority. She paused, eyes sweeping the room as if she owned the grief inside it, and went on, saying that sometimes God's mercy is strange, that my boys had been spared a life of suffering, that maybe their home, our home, was never the right place for their souls. Each pause was perfectly timed so people could nod along, like parishioners agreeing with a preacher. I wanted to shout then. I wanted to finally list every jab she'd thrown at me since the day I married her son, every critique about how I sterilized bottles, how I folded onesies, how I calmed a cry. Her smile that cut like vinegar, her tone dripping with, "You're not enough." I wanted to tear the mask from her words, but inside me it felt like rubble had collapsed over my throat. My voice was buried under it all. My mouth was desert dry. In the 3rd row, I caught sight of my parents. They had flown through the night to be here, and their faces still looked stunned, as if they hadn't fully entered this nightmare yet. My mom pressed a white handkerchief so tightly to her lips, her knuckles went pale. My dad's stare was fixed on Mrs. Whitmore, solid and unblinking, the kind of look he used to give when I was little and a neighbor's kid pushed me off the swing. But even he didn't speak. Nobody spoke. It was her stage, her voice echoing in a room where mine should have been. And all the while, I stood there, my daughter's tiny hand in mine, trying to remember how to breathe. My dad's eyes stayed locked on her, that steady, unflinching glare he always carried when someone crossed a line, but even he stayed silent. It was a funeral after all, and there are rules about when you're allowed to speak and when you're expected to swallow it all down. That silence gave her more room. Mrs. Whitmore's voice filled the chapel, polished like steel, every syllable sharp enough to cut. She spoke about how she'd come by to help me on Tuesdays and Thursdays, how she'd shown me structure, routine, the proper way to mother, and then she slipped the knife in, saying pride blinds some women, that weakness hides behind stubbornness. She said pride and weakness, as if she were rocking a baby, soft and sing-song, a caress in the air, but what I heard was poison wrapped in pretty paper. Somewhere behind me, a whisper slithered through the pews. The house was always messy, wasn't it? Another voice. She had 3 kids. Must have been depression. The murmurs spread like mold creeping across damp drywall, quiet but relentless. Beside me, Michael let out that practiced sigh I knew too well. The one that said I don't agree, but I'm not going to challenge her either. It was the sound of surrender, of convenience, of someone who'd chosen peace over truth for far too long. And inside me, something shifted. At first it was fear rising, that hot tingle at the base of my spine, but then fear lit into anger, and anger carried its own strange warmth. My pulse beat loud in my ears, drowning out the whispers. And then I felt her hand slip out of mine. My Sophie, my little girl, suddenly pulling away. I caught just a glimpse of her straightening her hem, her tiny shoulders stiffening like she was marching into a storm. Before I could react, she was moving forward, her patent leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. That sound was louder than any whisper, louder even than my own breath. Each step was defiance, cutting through the funeral hush, commanding every eye in the room. It was like time slowed. I wanted to stop her, to pull her back, to protect her from the weight of what was about to happen. But something in me froze. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was a mother's intuition that this wasn't mine to carry anymore. She was stepping into a place no adult had dared to go, and I knew somehow she wasn't going to back down. I remember catching sight of our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, across the aisle. She'd baked us casseroles the week after the boys died, always with that sad, pitying tilt of the head. Now she sat forward on the edge of her seat, lips parted, eyes wide, as if she knew she was about to witness something no one in this town would forget. And I just stood there, heart pounding in my throat, as my 7-year-old daughter walked straight toward the microphone, ready to break the silence that none of us had been brave enough to shatter. And then it happened. Sophie's little voice, steady but impossibly small against the silence, rang out clear as a bell. "I want to tell you what Grandma did. She was putting something in the baby's bottles." The words landed like stones dropped in still water, and the ripples spread instantly through the chapel. I swear I heard someone gasp out loud, sharp and scandalized, before the entire room seemed to freeze. Mrs. Whitmore jerked like she'd been shocked, her shoulders snapping tight, her lips pulled back just enough to show the edge of her teeth. Michael shot upright beside me, the movement so sudden it made me sway, and without thinking I stumbled forward too, as if my body just needed to be closer to my daughter, to shield her somehow. My husband's voice softened, practiced, coaxing. "Sweetheart, what do you mean?" His tone sounded like he was talking her down from a ledge, but Sophie's reply came crisp, deliberate. "Last Thursday," she said, her little chin tilted up, "I went to get some juice. Grandma was in the kitchen. Your black bag was open. Every eye in the room was locked on her, this 7-year-old girl in her scuffed patent leather shoes." Her voice didn't waver. She was crushing pills and pouring the powder into the baby's bottles. A hiss tore through the air. "Lies!" Mrs. Whitmore spat, her voice cracking in outrage, her hands clutching the edge of her purse like she might swing it. "Bold, wicked lies!" She lunged half a step forward, but Michael's arm shot out, palm raised, stopping her cold. For the first time in years, he was blocking his mother's path instead of mine. And Sophie, my God, she didn't flinch. She reached into her tiny purse and pulled out that old phone I'd given her to play games on years ago. My stomach dropped. The screen glowed, her little fingers swiped with calm precision, scrolling, searching, finding. She looked up, steady as stone. "I took pictures," she said. "Here." The images flickered in front of the crowd, and even from where I stood I recognized it instantly. Our kitchen. The white marble countertop I had begged Michael not to let his mother touch. The bottles lined on a towel, the harsh overhead light turning the glass into cold reflections. And there she was, Mrs. Whitmore in her pressed black suit, bent over like a scientist in a lab. One shot showed her hand gripping a bottle with a label I couldn't quite read, but I knew it wasn't vitamins. The next captured a spoon halfway filled with a fine powder. And the last, God help me, the last showed her shaking the mixture, a froth of milk and white foam blooming inside the plastic. The whispers cracked open into a low, rolling murmur that grew and spread until it felt like the whole room was buzzing with disbelief. People craned their necks, clutching their pearls, whispering names of pills they half remembered from their own medicine cabinets. Michael moved forward, one step, then another, his lips forming words he couldn't quite get out. "It can't be," or "maybe let me see." And I just stood there, heart pounding so violently it shook my ribs, watching the room fracture into truth and denial, and knowing my little girl had just done what none of us had dared to. She'd ripped the mask clean off. The room tilted around me, the edges of the coffins and the polished pews blurring like watercolor in the rain. My knees wobbled, and I felt my father's hand clamp firmly around my elbow, grounding me, keeping me from collapsing right there in front of everyone. And then, in that same calm, almost sing-song tone she used when reciting poems at school, Sophie went on, "After that, they slept and didn't wake up." The words were so steady, so heartbreakingly clear, that a few people actually covered their mouths in shock. She told the room how her grandmother had explained it to her, that it was a good sleep, that quiet babies were healthy babies, that even I needed to learn how to do it. My daughter's tiny voice carrying the words of cruelty I hadn't heard myself, words that now landed like heavy stones in the gut of every person listening. Mrs. Whitmore's voice suddenly cracked through the tension, louder now, desperate, defensive. "It was just a sedative, just a little. You can't go running every time a child fusses. I was helping. I only wanted what was best." She flung those words into the chapel as if they could somehow stick to the walls and drown out the truth glowing from my daughter's phone screen. By then, my dad already had his cell out, his thumb moving fast, his jaw tight. My mom, too. Her voice always had this strange steadiness when she was under pressure, almost soothing, but this time it carried steel. "Yes, officer, we need you here now." Around us, relatives shifted like a wave, some standing, some collapsing back into their seats. A couple of the more devout crossed themselves over and over, their whispers of prayer colliding with the gasps of disbelief around them. Michael just stood there, a statue in his dark suit. And for the first time, I could see it, his whole world crumbling in front of him. That polished confidence he always carried, built on his mother's authority, turning to ash right there in his eyes. Finally, his voice broke through, raspy, uncertain. Did you see this before?" he asked our daughter, almost like he was begging for another answer. Sophie nodded, her little face solemn. "Yes, more than once. I wrote it down too, so I wouldn't forget, so no one could say it wasn't real." And that was when Mrs. Whitmore's eyes found mine. I'll never forget that look. Every emotion colliding all at once, fear tightening her pupils, hatred flashing like heat lightning, the sting of betrayal, the pure disbelief that the world had dared to push back against her control. For decades, she'd bent everything to her will, reshaping truth to fit her needs, and now a 7-year-old child had unraveled her entire empire with nothing but courage and a borrowed phone. Her voice snapped like a whip through the chapel. "This is all you're doing. You turned my own grandchild against me." And then, for the first time in years, Michael's voice cut through hers. Rough, broken, nothing like the polished tone he used at work or at dinner parties. "Enough, Mom." His words landed heavy, like stones thrown into the crowd. He said it again, louder this time. "Enough." And the murmurs surged into a low roar, the sound of a dam cracking. I heard a clatter somewhere behind us, a bracelet slipping off a wrist, tumbling against the tile, and then the rustle of dresses as people shifted restlessly in their seats. A baby let out a thin, wavering cry from the far back row, quickly muffled against a mother's chest. The tension in the air had grown so thick it was almost physical, pressing down on everyone. And then came that sound. The wail of a siren, muffled through the walls at first, then sharper as it stopped just outside. My dad's eyes found mine, and he gave the slightest nod. This was it. I stepped toward Sophie, my heels sinking into the carpet as the crowd parted on instinct, avoiding my eyes. Some dropped their gazes to the floor, too ashamed to look. Others fumbled with their phones, slipping them into purses, while a handful brazenly kept recording, arms lifted high as if the truth unfolding here was entertainment. I reached her at the front, laid my hand on her small shoulder. She was burning with heat, her body solid, unflinching, like a stone polished by waves and bleached by sun. My throat ached, but I found my voice, soft, steady. "I'm right here." She didn't look at me, didn't need to. She was steady enough for both of us. And then the doors swung open. Officers in uniform stepped inside, not later, not somewhere down the road, but right there, into the very heart of it. Between the coffins, our names, our grief. The world we'd known had already shattered, but in that moment, I watched it start to stitch itself back together, thread by thread, along the lines my daughter had drawn with her small, unyielding hand. I knew what would come next: questions, statements, protocols. The autopsy revisited, new analyses, retesting. I knew the looks would follow me, too, those accusing eyes that didn't have to say out loud what they thought, that I should have seen, should have noticed, should have stopped it. But in that breath between the siren and the hush, between denial and proof, one thing was undeniable. The truth had entered the room with my little girl, and it wasn't leaving. And there she was, Mrs. Whitmore, still clutching her pearls like a rosary, her fingers digging into them as if she could choke down her terror with a strand of beads. Just minutes before, she'd been so certain, so smug in her belief that the right words could drown out facts. Now she stood frozen, her lips trembling, repeating the same phrase like it might rewrite reality. I was helping, but no one believed her anymore. Not after this. All she ever wanted was order. That's what she called it. Order, obedience, silence. And now the silence in that chapel had grown so dense it was almost tangible, a blanket pressing down on every chest. You could hear the smallest things: the faint vibration of a phone buzzing in someone's pocket, the brittle crack of a candle wick fighting to stay lit. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see who would speak next, waiting to see if truth would keep pushing its way through. I lifted my eyes to Michael. He wasn't looking at me. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on those photographs, on the marble countertop of our kitchen, on the pill bottles he himself had once carried into our home without a second thought, on his mother's hand, caught forever in the glow of that camera flash. His suit, so crisp just an hour ago, sagged against his shoulders, and I realized in that moment he looked hollow, like the fabric couldn't disguise the emptiness underneath anymore. And then Sophie's little voice broke through that suffocating stillness. "Daddy, I'm not lying." He opened his mouth, closed it again, nodded once, twice, like the words were jammed somewhere deep inside his throat. No denial came, no defense for his mother, no gentle dismissal of his daughter's truth. Just silence. And sometimes silence is cowardice. But sometimes silence is its own kind of confession. Outside, the siren fell quiet. The heavy chapel doors thudded shut behind the officers who were now moving among us, their presence shifting the air, marking the moment when grief turned into investigation. Papers rustled, pens scratched, and suddenly, the space that had been filled with hymns and condolences became a room of questions. Names, dates, times. Every question carried its own sharp edge, a needle pricking at the fabric of the story we'd all been told. No, this wasn't sudden infant death syndrome. No, babies don't simply slip away together in the same night. No, God didn't pluck them out of my arms because I wasn't worthy. Every no threaded itself to the next, weaving together the truth we had all been too afraid to look at. Each needle carried a strand, and my daughter, my brave, stubborn little girl, was holding the other end tightly in her hand, refusing to let it go. And in that weave of silence and sirens, of whispered prayers and harsh questions, the picture of what really happened began to emerge. It was ugly, it was unbearable, but it was real. And in that truth, as painful as it was, there was something else too, a flicker of hope. Because for the first time in months, I felt the ground under my feet start to steady. Not because the nightmare was over, but because the lies had finally started to unravel. The thing about truth is that no matter how hard someone tries to cut the thread, there's always another hand gripping the other end. And my Sophie, my 7-year-old, already had that thread wrapped around her tiny palm, refusing to let it slip. She was the one holding it steady while the rest of us flailed. It's almost unbearable now to look back just 3 months and remember how perfect everything seemed. We'd finally made it to that dream I thought would never come true. A little house in the suburbs outside Seattle, with white shutters and a nursery painted the softest blue, clouds drifting lazily across the ceiling. A swing set out back where I pictured the boys tumbling one day, their sister bossing them around. After 5 long years of negative pregnancy tests and doctor visits that left me hollow, I finally held my miracle. Not just one, but two. 2 warm little bundles pressed against me, proof that waiting and praying hadn't been for nothing. I remember that first moment in the hospital when I saw them side by side in their plastic bassinets. My heart stuttered like it couldn't keep up. Michael wept openly, cradling them against his chest, kissing their downy heads like he was afraid they'd vanish. Even Mrs. Whitmore, of all people, softened enough to stroke their cheeks. But even in that tender moment, she slipped in her little daggers, remarking how real women gave birth without anesthesia, letting that shadow fall across my happiness. Still, I brushed it off. I would have forgiven anything, swallowed any insult if it meant my boys would grow up safe and strong. Those first weeks were chaos and bliss woven together. I'd balance one baby at my breast while rocking the other with my foot in his cradle. I typed emails for clients at the kitchen table with spit up on my shirt and a pacifier clenched between my teeth. Sometimes I collapsed face down on the couch, still in yesterday's clothes, too tired to care, but it felt worth it. I was exhausted, yes, but I was doing it. We were doing it. And then she came, not just into the house, but into the very air I breathed, into the space that should have been mine to learn and stumble and grow as a mother. Mrs. Whitmore swept in like she owned the place, as if she'd been waiting for her chance to take control. Suddenly, everything I did was wrong. How I sterilized bottles, how I folded laundry, how I comforted my crying boys. She'd tilt her head, her voice dripping with mock concern. 3 kids and a job? Are you out of your mind? You need help. But help was never what she offered. What she gave was judgment, a constant reminder that in her eyes I wasn't enough. And little by little, without even realizing it, I started to believe her. I'll be coming by. That's how she put it, like a decree, not a question. I tried to push back, told her we were fine, that Sophie was managing her homework on her own, that she even helped me with the babies sometimes, that I hadn't asked for anyone's help. But Michael, tired from his endless business trips, worn down to the bone, just nodded at her, eager to hand over responsibility. Let Mom stay. It'll make things easier for you. Easier. That was the word he used, and that was how her visits became routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays, without fail. She showed up at 8 o'clock sharp, every time. Her key turned in the lock like she owned it, and soon enough she was moving through our kitchen as though she had been running the place all along. She rearranged jars of baby food, reorganized drawers, swapped pots and pans from one cabinet to another. She left her fingerprints on everything, and when I dared to object, to tell her to leave things as they were, she gave me this look. That look that froze words in my throat, a look of smug superiority, like she was watching me fail in real time. It took only a few visits before I realized she wasn't helping at all. She was testing me. Every glance, every pointed pause, every suggestion dipped in honey but carrying venom underneath. The message was always the same. You're not a real mother. You'll never get this right. I felt it burrowing into me, like mold you don't notice until it's already spread. And I couldn't shake the suspicion that this wasn't just about me, it was about him, her son. Michael had been under her thumb for so long that my existence felt like a trespass. My mistakes were her proof that he still belonged to her. Every stumble I made was her victory lap, her way of reminding him that no one could replace her influence. But what gnawed at me most wasn't the judgment. It was the bag, Michael's black medical sample bag. He worked for a pharmaceutical company, and sometimes he brought home boxes of samples, pills, vials, small containers meant for doctors. It was supposed to be harmless, just part of his job. Most of the time he left the bag tucked away in the corner of the kitchen, forgotten. I never touched it, but she noticed it immediately. Her eyes lingered on that bag the way a child stares at a cookie jar, too long, too curious. I caught her once, casually asking about it, her voice light, almost playful. "What's in there?" I told her flatly, "Sedatives. For adults. Don't even think about it." She laughed, as if I'd said something silly, as if the idea of boundaries was a joke. Looking back now, I realize that was the first crack in the wall, the first time I should have felt the ground shift under me, the first warning that the danger wasn't outside my home, it was already inside, walking in with her key at 8 o'clock sharp. I knew those samples were meant for doctors, not for us. I never touched them, never even peeked inside that black bag. But Mrs. Whitmore, she eyed it like she already knew exactly what was in there, like she had memorized every label before I'd even noticed them. One morning, her tone all casual, she asked, "What's in those little bottles?" The way she said it was too light, too practiced, like she was fishing for permission. "Sedatives," I snapped, sharper than I meant to. "They're for adults. Don't even think about it." She just smiled, one of those tight, amused smirks that said she wasn't taking me seriously. I remember brushing it off, convincing myself I'd overreacted. But what I didn't know then was that Sophie had already started to notice things. My little girl, just 7, with eyes that saw more than most adults, and a silence she carried like armor, because she understood no one would believe her if she spoke too soon. She began staying home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, those helpful days when her grandmother showed up. She'd fake a stomachache or a headache, her hand pressed flat to her belly, her face pale with a seriousness kids can't fake. And while I played the part of the frazzled mom, half convinced by her excuses, her eyes told a different story. Wide, uneasy, like she was holding on to something too heavy for her age. At night, when I tucked her into bed, she whispered questions that should have stopped me cold. "Mom, does Grandma feed the babies the right way?" I laughed nervously, stroked her hair, and lied. "Of course, sweetheart. She knows what she's doing. She's experienced." But Sophie wouldn't let it go. "But you do it different." Her words lingered like smoke in the back of my mind, but I pushed them away. Kids notice odd little details all the time, don't they? That's what I told myself. They exaggerate, they imagine. And I was so tired, so desperate to believe things were under control, that I didn't let myself hear the warning in her voice. Looking back, I realized she was trying to save us. She was sounding the alarm in the only way she knew how. And while I brushed her off, convincing myself I knew better, Mrs. Whitmore was growing bolder. She stopped hiding her irritation when I scooped the babies up at the first sound of their cries. She'd purse her lips, shake her head, and mutter about how spoiled children become when you rush to comfort them. Her favorite line, repeated like a mantra, was, "Children need to be trained to be quiet." Back then, I thought it was just her old-fashioned way of speaking. Now I know it was her plan. Training wasn't a metaphor, it was her justification. And I, blind with exhaustion and denial, kept telling myself she only wanted to help. "That's how they'll grow up spoiled, Janet. You've got to train children to be quiet." Those were her favorite words, rolled off her tongue like gospel. At the time, I thought it was just one of her metaphors, some old-fashioned phrase about discipline. I never understood it was her plan all along. She wanted proof. Proof that I was weak, incapable, unfit to be the kind of mother her son deserved. And if that meant drugging my babies to make them sleep, well, she told herself it was a blessing. And me? I was still doing backflips trying to keep peace in that house, still believing if I worked hard enough, smiled wide enough, maybe those cold eyes of hers would thaw just a little. I told myself it was about family harmony, when deep down I knew it was about survival. That Thursday started out quieter than usual, and at first I thought it was a gift. Michael had left before dawn for another business trip, his black medical sample bag tossed carelessly by the kitchen table like it was nothing, though I had begged him to keep it far from the kids. I remember lying there in bed, the house wrapped in stillness. Too much stillness. By 5 a.m. I woke with a jolt. It wasn't the baby's cries that pulled me from sleep. No, it was the absence of them. After 3 months, I was trained like clockwork. If Noah didn't wake, Caleb did. Their cries were as reliable as an alarm. But that morning, nothing. Just a silence so thick it rang in my ears. I pulled on my robe, heart already hammering, and padded down the hall. The nursery door was cracked open, too wide. I knew I'd closed it the night before, just enough to let the light from the hallway spill in. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. That faint mix of formula and baby lotion, familiar and comforting. But that morning it carried something else too. Something stale, something wrong. I went to Noah's crib first. His tiny face was still, too still, his lips tinged with a blue that didn't belong there. My knees nearly gave out. I whispered his name, my hands trembling as I scooped him up, his body limp against me. My breath came in gasps, ragged and panicked, as I moved to Caleb's crib, praying, bargaining with every step. But it was the same. Stillness, silence. The world tilted sideways. I shook them gently, then harder, begging them to stir, to whimper, to do anything. Nothing. My own screams filled the nursery, raw and tearing. The sound of an animal caught in a trap. The silence I had once begged for, the silence their grandmother had preached like a virtue, was now a curse that hollowed out my soul. And in that moment, staring at my boys who would never cry again, I finally understood what she had meant by training them to be quiet. His tiny chest wasn't moving, not rising, not falling, nothing. No, no, no. The words ripped out of me as I yanked him into my arms, his skin already cool, and I screamed so loud it rattled in my own ears, as if my body was trying to shake him back to life with the sound alone. I turned and saw Caleb the same way, still, silent, wrong. That's when Michael burst in, hair sticking up, eyes wide, frozen for half a second by the sound coming out of me. Then he lunged forward, scooping Caleb up, pressing his lips to that tiny mouth, blowing air into him, thumping his chest like sheer force, and Will could reverse whatever had happened. He looked wild, desperate, as if he believed love alone could fight biology. My hands fumbled for the phone, shaking so badly I couldn't even find the numbers at first. 913, then backspace, no, 910. Finally I managed 911, my fingers slipping on the glass. The dispatcher's voice came calm, detached, as if she were floating miles away in some quiet office. How old are they? Are they breathing? Stay on the line. Her words reached me through fog, like cotton stuffed in my ears. I stammered answers in broken pieces, not even sure what I was saying, just trying to make the words match the panic clawing out of me. The paramedics came so fast it felt unreal. The room filled with uniforms and bags, the snap of latex gloves, the sharp smell of alcohol wipes. They laid out equipment, cracked open ampules, and placed my boys gently onto stiff surfaces, pressing 2 fingers into their fragile chests in perfect rhythm, like a metronome of hope. I stood against the wall, clutching my robe, watching strangers pump the life out of my children's bodies, and I knew from the looks they gave each other, tiny, resigned flickers, they weren't saving them anymore. They were saving us, cushioning the blow, making sure we didn't feel abandoned in the abyss. At 5:23 a.m., the words fell flat and heavy. Time of death for both infants. Just like that, a line drawn in the sand. Later, they told us it was SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. Rare, they said, but it happens, more likely with twins. When one stops breathing, sometimes the other follows. The words were so clinical, so neat, as though science could box up the horror into something tolerable. But to me, it sounded like mockery. I couldn't believe it, but I also couldn't fight. My body had no strength left for arguing. An hour later, she arrived, Mrs. Whitmore. No one had called her. That's what sent a shiver through me, even then. She walked in as if she already knew, her arms spreading wide. Not for me, not for my babies, but for her son. She clutched Michael as he sagged into her, whispering, "My poor boy, my poor boy." Not our loss, not our grandchildren, just her tragedy, just him. And I stood there, hollowed out, realizing even in that moment she was still rewriting the story to make it hers. I stood there like a shadow, invisible even in my own home. I wanted to scream, to shove her out of the doorway, but Michael sat slumped against her shoulder, motionless, his grief swallowed whole by her embrace. He didn't even glance at me, not once, as if I wasn't part of the loss at all. The days that followed blurred into one long smear of black, flowers with their suffocating perfume, papers needing signatures, the endless shuffle of strangers moving through my house, funeral directors with low voices, neighbors carrying casseroles, my mother-in-law barking decisions like a general. Which casket, which hymns, which arrangements. She took control of everything, and I let her, because I had nothing left to fight with. And still, her voice carried louder than mine, drowning me out in my own grief. But Sophie's eyes, those eyes never let me go. She watched me quietly, the way children do when they know something the adults don't. Her gaze said more than words, but I was too broken to piece it together. I thought she was just scared, clinging to me, trying to be strong. I didn't realize she was already holding the truth in her small hands, waiting for the right moment to let it out. The morning of the funeral was gray, drizzle sliding down the windows of the chapel like even the sky was weeping. I sat in the front row, hollowed out, scorched from the inside, my daughter pressed against my left side, quiet as a shadow, her little body stiff in that black dress that made her look older than she was. Michael sat on my right, stone-faced, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles blanched white. Between us there was a chasm, a silence deeper than death itself. He hadn't touched me once since that night, and I knew we were already miles apart, even as we sat shoulder to shoulder. When the police finally came for her, Mrs. Whitmore, the world tilted again. Even then, I couldn't let myself believe it was real. Our lives twisted into interrogation rooms, endless statements, rehashing the worst night of my life for people with clipboards and straight faces. Every time I thought I couldn't bear another question, another form, I saw Sophie's face, steady and serious, and it kept me upright. And then the experts confirmed what she had already laid bare. The toxicology results were clear. Both my boys had been dosed with a powerful sedative. It wasn't SIDS. It wasn't an act of God. It wasn't fate. It was deliberate. And the only reason the truth saw daylight was because a 7-year-old child had been brave enough to speak when all the adults were too paralyzed to move. The first autopsy came back clean. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why 2 perfectly healthy babies had stopped breathing on the same night. That was almost worse than the loss itself, the implication that there was no reason, that maybe it really was fate. But then came the second round of tests, ordered after the photographs and Sophie's diary were handed over. That's when everything snapped into place. The sedative wasn't common, not something labs look for in standard panels. Rare, potent, and hidden until someone knew where to shine the light. Michael sat across from me in that sterile little conference room when the results were read. He looked like a man hollowed out, like his bones had lost the strength to hold him upright. His words spilled out in fragments, broken confessions. I brought those meds into the house. I gave her the key. I told you she'd help. I killed them. And I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. There was nothing left to say. His silence, his blind faith in his mother, it had been just as poisonous as the powder she slipped into those bottles. The trial came quickly, faster than I expected. It felt strange, walking into a courtroom after months of funerals and interviews, as though grief had been repackaged into legal language. Sophie took the stand. My little girl, legs barely reaching the floor, her voice steady and strong. Stronger than grown men I'd heard testify. She held her diary in her lap, pages with smudged handwriting and crooked hearts in the margins. She read it out loud, entry by entry. Friday, Grandma said Mommy was stupid, that she didn't know how to raise babies. Grandma put powder in the bottle and said it was vitamins, but I know vitamins don't look like that. Then she turned the page. Tuesday, Grandma said today they'll sleep so deep nothing will wake them. She laughed. The room was so quiet, I swear you could hear the scratch of pens against paper. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed, listening as though every word weighed more than the evidence itself. The defense attorney tried to paint her as confused, tried to cast Mrs. Whitmore as a frail old woman mixing up dosages by accident. But the photos and Sophie's words tore through that flimsy argument like paper in the rain. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty on both counts of murder. The sentence, life in prison without parole. The judge's voice was firm, final, and when he spoke those words, Mrs. Whitmore erupted, her mask cracking for the first time. "You destroyed my life. I only wanted order. I only wanted quiet." But no one believed her anymore. Not after what had been uncovered. Order had been her excuse, silence her weapon, and now she would spend the rest of her life trapped in a silence she couldn't control. Silence. That's what lingered after they led her away in handcuffs. And for the first time in months, I let myself cry freely, without fear of being judged for it, without worrying that someone would call my tears weakness. They were mine. They belonged to me. A month later, Michael filed for divorce. He told me he couldn't look at me anymore, that every time he did, he saw his own cowardice reflected back. "I stayed quiet when I should have defended you. I betrayed you. There's no forgiveness for that." His words weren't cruel, just hollow, resigned. And I didn't stop him. I didn't beg. Because he was right. Each of us carries our own guilt, our own sentence, and his wasn't mine to lighten. So Sophie and I left. We traded the big suburban house with its swing set and painted clouds on the ceiling for a tiny apartment 2 streets over from my parents'. No shutters, no manicured lawn, no picture-perfect nursery. But there was quiet. Not the suffocating, manufactured silence Mrs. Whitmore had worshipped, but real quiet. The kind where you can breathe again. Sophie started therapy. She began filling notebooks again, only this time they weren't filled with warnings and fear. They were filled with sketches of her friends, notes about school projects, lists of books she wanted to read. Sometimes I'd find her diary resting on her brother's grave, her little hands pressed against the stone as she whispered, "I wrote it all down. Nobody can pretend they didn't see." Those moments broke me and healed me at the same time, because I realized my daughter had been stronger than every adult in that courtroom, stronger than me, stronger than her father. She had held the thread when the rest of us let it slip. A year passed, and the numbness gave way to something else, a drive I hadn't felt in years. I began speaking at conferences about domestic control, about subtle violence that doesn't leave bruises but leaves scars just the same. I stood in front of parents and told them what I had learned the hardest way possible. Listen to your children. Really listen. They notice the cracks adults look away from. They see the shadows we convince ourselves aren't there. Sometimes their voices are the only shield against danger. And every time I stood behind that microphone, I thought of Sophie's voice in the chapel, trembling but unyielding, slicing through a room full of whispers. The sound of a little girl refusing to be silenced. The sound that saved me. Sometimes a child's words are the only shield we have against the kind of danger adults refuse to see. That's what I tell people now when I stand behind a microphone. I talk about my boys, not as victims, not as 2 lives stolen too soon, but as the reason the truth finally came to light. And I talk about my daughter, my brave Sophie, who found the strength to stand up in front of a room full of grown-ups paralyzed by silence, and tell the truth out loud. At the cemetery, there are always 2 little teddy bears resting on their grave. Sophie brought them herself. She tied a small note to each paw with her careful handwriting. "I love you." Simple words, but they carry the weight of everything we lost, and everything we still carry forward. She told me once, her voice steady, that Grandma can't hurt anyone anymore. I wrote it down, Mom, and the whole world knows now. And she's right. The whole world does know. That notebook, those photographs, her tiny voice, all of it traveled further than my screams ever could. For years, I thought silence was survival, that if I stayed small and tried hard enough, maybe I could keep the peace. But it took a 7-year-old to remind me that peace built on lies is nothing but a trap. I stood by their grave not long ago, the drizzle soaking through my jacket, my hand resting on the cold stone, and I realized something I never thought I'd feel. Their lives, as brief as they were, still had power. They forced truth into the light. They showed me who I could become when there was nothing left to lose. Their deaths were not meaningless. Because one day, in a room heavy with grief and denial, a child's voice rose above every lie, every excuse, every adult who chose comfort over courage. And that voice cut through like a bell, sharp and clear, echoing far beyond those walls. And I believe it will keep echoing. Every time I tell our story, every time another parent leans in a little closer to their child, every time someone chooses to listen instead of dismiss, my daughter's voice will keep saving lives. That's what I hold on to now. Not just the memory of what we lost, but the strength of what we found. A truth too loud to bury. A 7-year-old's courage that proved stronger than a lifetime of silence. And if you've listened all the way through my story, I just want to ask you one thing. Don't let it fade into silence. Leave a comment and tell me what you felt, because stories like this only matter if they're heard. Hit that like button so more people can find it, and subscribe if you want to stand with me in making sure no child's voice ever gets ignored again. Your support means more than you know.